Hey, AP Euro fans, this is Mr. Iglesias, and this is another installment of the AP Euro videos that we're producing. Today we're going to talk about the document-based question. What is the DBQ, or document-based question? It's simply just another essay, much like the LEQ that you were taught by Mr. Hunt on a previous video. This particular essay is worth 25% of your score on an AP exam. It's graded on a 0 to 7 scale instead of a 0 to 6 scale like the LEQ. But its biggest difference is exactly how you find evidence to defend your thesis. In this essay, you don't just simply have to remember stuff from the top of your head like you do on the LEQ. In this essay, you actually are given material from where to select content to provide evidence for your particular argument in your thesis. The evidence is found in 7 primary source documents that are provided for you on the exam. Now, the good part about this obviously is that you don't have to just remember stuff off the top of your head. If the prompt happens to be something you don't remember a lot about, you've got all sorts of information that you can use to put into your essay. The difficulty, of course, is being able to read, comprehend, analyze, and then use the material that you find in these primary source documents. I'm sure at this point, probably all of your teachers have gone over how to interpret primary source documents. They maybe given you some techniques and tips. I know with my students, I've used the HIPPO technique, where you're looking for historical context, intended audience, purpose, point of view, and outside evidence. There are other ways that people can address trying to figure out how to interpret primary source documents, but that's going to be an important skill because you won't be able to use those documents toward your evidence if you can't understand what it is you're reading. Let's first take a look at the actual rubric of this essay. So when you're looking at this essay, you'll notice at the beginning that the first 2 points that you can earn out of the 7 in the DBQ are just like what Mr. Hunt taught you: the thesis and claim and contextualization. Now, if you haven't gone over this before, you can always look back. I know the video that Mr. Hunt has posted on my Google Classroom, and you can also find it on our AP Euro Guys YouTube channel. So you can go back and look over those. I'm not going to go over all this information again, since Mr. Hunt did a fine job explaining just what a thesis is and what contextualization is. You'll also notice that another similarity is this analysis and reasoning point for demonstrating complex understanding. So we're going to go along with the exact same hint or tip that Mr. Hunt gave you about how to earn this point. He insisted that the best way to get that point was to create a counter argument. And we're going to do that same thing. Again, if you need to go back and look at that, Mr. Hunt's video is on our YouTube channel, and you can review what exactly finding a counter argument is. So here are the 4 points that are new to the document-based question. 1 point, well, possibly up to 2 points, come from being able to use the documents, the content in each document, to actually address the topic and defend your thesis with information found in primary source documents. Now, you can earn 1 point by using the information in 3 of those documents to help your argument. But I think all of us are going to really push for everyone to shoot for using 6 documents so that you can earn 2 points. If you don't do this, it would be like taking a 100-point math test, looking at the last 15 questions and just tearing them out of your test booklet and throwing them away. You're basically giving up the opportunity to get 100% and settling for 85 or so percent. So we always think that you should, I always think anyways, that you should always shoot for using 6 or maybe even all of the documents that are provided you. Now, let's look at exactly what they say you're supposed to do in terms of actually using these documents. It says to earn the point, the response must accurately describe, rather than simply quote, the content from at least 3 of the documents. For 2 points, the response must accurately describe, rather than simply quote, the content of 6. In addition, the response must use the content of the documents to support an argument. So what you're going to find on these DBQs, these 7 documents they give you, they're rather long primary source docs. Most of them are textual. They're writing. And you really have to do a lot of work to read through them and understand them. They're often 2 paragraphs long, or sometimes even more. So at the beginning, when you take this exam, at the beginning of the DBQ section, you're given 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, the College Board expects that you will preview all 7 of the documents, most of them text-based, some of them can be visual. And as you look through those documents, you're looking for, how does the material, how does the content in these documents have anything to do with the prompt they gave me? It should be pretty clear. So as you look through there, you'll get some ideas of which documents you might be able to use for your argument. You cannot simply draw quotes from them and throw them into your essay and hope you're going to get points. You have to describe what the document's actually saying. And more importantly, your description of what the document's saying has to actually support what it is you're arguing in your thesis. So there are 2 of the 4 points. The third of the 4 points is actually very much like the LEQ. Now we're talking about evidence beyond the documents. This is simply information that you already know about the topic in the prompt, but was never mentioned in any of the 7 documents. So this is actually just like the LEQ, where you're pulling things out from your brain that you remember from class and helping to defend your argument with that. You need to do that at least once. And as we'll find out, the evidence that you put here cannot be the same as evidence you put in the contextualization, nor can it be the same as the information you put in your complexity section. And it always has to be more than just a phrase or brief reference. I always tell students it's good if you can make two sentences maybe about this evidence beyond the documents. And lastly, the fourth of the 4 points comes from something that I've always found students find a little more challenging. And that's just because they're not always sure what it is they're trying to do. One of the analysis points you earn comes for at least 3 of the documents that you use. So if you're using 6 documents, half of them, you have to do this. Explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and/or audience is relevant to the argument. So what does this really mean? Well, you and I both know that no matter what gets written or said by a person, it's almost always got some kind of bias to it, right? Whenever you say something, or it comes from your perspective, your point of view. And depending on who you're speaking to, the contents of what you're saying can change. It's the same with historical documents. Every historical document that's written comes from the point of view of the author. Any historical document that's an image, well, that artist or that political cartoonist or whatever, they've got a certain type of bias or point of view as well. It's your job to point out and identify to the reader of your essay that you understand what that bias is. Let me give you a really quick example. Let's say the prompt had to do with the Lutheran Reformation, which we just learned about. And in it, there is a document written by Martin Luther concerning indulgences. Now, you and I know, because of what we know about history, that if Martin Luther's writing about the indulgence system, it is going to be a negative opinion, because that's the way he feels about things. We know he's a reformer. We know that he believes that the indulgence system isn't just taking money from people, but it's leading people astray to make them think they can save themselves when they're not really saving themselves. So we know that if it were something that he wrote about indulgences, it would not be positive. It would be entirely different if that document about indulgences was written by a Catholic priest or the Pope. Again, their perspective comes from someone who's part of the institution that actually promotes the sale of these things. So you can see where there's obvious bias or point of view based on what type of job the person has and based on who that person is. So there you have all 7 points. Now, although I didn't go over these in detail, I am going to go a little bit over them when I introduce to you this prompt. So let's stop sharing here and move on to the actual prompt portion of this. All right. So a few years back, this was actually a prompt that was given by the College Board. I just happened to alter it a little bit so that it fits more like the kind of prompt we would see today. Okay, so here's what the prompt asks you to do. It says, evaluate whether the German peasant revolts of the 1520s were caused more by religious discontent or socioeconomic discontent. In other words, why did peasants rise up? Now, when we were studying the Lutheran Reformation, I'm sure everyone went over a little bit at least about the peasant revolts, how they rose up and started destroying property and attacking lords. And then eventually, of course, Luther issued his statement to the princes of Germany, who then came back and slaughtered all these peasants who had risen up against them. Now, if this is the prompt, obviously you have to choose. Am I going to say that those things were caused by religious discontent, or am I going to say that it was social and economic problems that caused this? As I said earlier, before you choose a side, it's always good to look over the documents and see, are they kind of guiding me to pick one of these or the other? Are there a whole bunch of documents in there that mention social and economic problems, or are there a bunch that talk about religious problems? If I see there seems to be more of one than the other, I might want to use that as my main argument and use the other as my counter argument. Let's say after we look over all this stuff, we notice that there were plenty of them that talked about social and economic problems. So that's going to be our main argument. So if, just as a reminder, what would that look like for your thesis? Your thesis would basically say that the German peasant revolts of the 1520s were clearly caused by social and economic problems. And then remember, you have to continue that thesis by saying because, or as is evidenced by, or something, and you have to give a couple pieces of evidence to tell the person why you think that it's mostly a social and economic problem. So you've got your thesis. What about your context? What's contextualization for something like this going to look like? Well, you clearly should have something about the Lutheran Reformation. I mean, regardless of whether you're arguing religion or socioeconomic, these revolts happened at this time for a very specific reason. Luther had certainly inspired these people. His 95 Thesis and then his conflict with the church taught people who were of lower rank that they didn't have to simply just take what was going on, that they could rise up and try to change what was going on. Now, according to Luther, these people were mistaken in thinking that this is supposed to be a social revolution, but still, he was the inspiration for them to rise up at a specific time. So someplace in your context should mention that. Probably most important, though, you should mention the condition of peasants in general. The condition in peasants throughout the Middle Ages, remember, many of them were serfs. They were basically owned by their landlords. They were often overworked. They were often overtaxed, and they weren't treated very well. It was a pretty miserable life. So you would probably have a sentence or two that introduces the reader to the general condition of peasants back then, explaining, you're giving background, you're telling people why these people would revolt. People don't revolt unless they're desperate. What's making these peasants desperate? That should be a part of your context as well. Now, in current DBQs, the documents themselves are going to be much longer than this, at least twice as long, sometimes more than that. This comes from an old DBQ back when they used to give you 11 or 12 documents. And because they gave you so many documents, they didn't make them nearly as long. So this, although it's good for our practice, is not probably what you're going to see when you actually do have to do this on the actual DBQ today. Now, the one thing I forgot to include here, and I suppose I could just put it right here very quickly, is, let's do this. There's always going to be a document number. And I believe this was actually document 2. So it's important that you know all the parts of these documents on DBQs. First, know the document number. You're going to need to include that in your essay writing because you want to make it easy for the reader to know when they're trying to grade your paper in 2 or 3 minutes. They want to see how many documents you used. If you don't use the actual phrase document 2 or something like that, they're going to be kind of lost as to try to figure it out. It's going to take them time to count up which documents you used. Secondly, something that a lot of people may want to just skip over because it's not the actual content of the material, this source line. This you cannot skip. It's absolutely essential that you read and know what this says. Never skip the source line and just go moving forward. Before you read this document, you should know who wrote it. They tell you that. They also usually tell you what kind of person this is in terms of their position in society. You need to know that too. They often tell you from where this excerpt actually comes, because often it comes from a book or diary or some kind of announcement or a decree from a king or something. So you should know that. And then they tell you when it happened. So you get an idea of some kind of chronology. So now you know there are these 2 people, a lay preacher and another preacher, both from this place Memmingen. Doesn't matter if we really know exactly where this is. We just know it's a German state or a German region. But knowing that these 2 people this is a craftsperson and a preacher, we know they're not of the upper class. We know that they're probably, at best, kind of somewhere in the middle. And they probably interact with peasants regularly. So then we look over this. These are the articles written by peasants. They are issuing these articles to their lords. They are telling the lords something. We will not allow ourselves hereafter to be oppressed by our lords, but will let them demand only what is just and proper according to the agreement between lords and peasants. Lords should no longer try to force more service or other dues from peasants without compensation. Peasants should, however, help lords when it is necessary and at proper times when it does not disadvantage the peasant and for a suitable compensation. Okay, so now we've seen what these folks have to say and what they're saying to their landlords. What do we do? How do we use this as our part of our evidence? Well, first, let's go back to what our thesis said. Our thesis basically makes a statement that we believe these revolts were caused primarily by economic and social ills suffered by peasants. That's why they did it. Now that kind of sets us up for writing 2 paragraphs. Hopefully we can find a 1 or 2 documents that discuss the economic problems that peasants were suffering And then we might find another one or two that discuss the social ills or the social problems that these peasants were facing. So now we've got two body paragraphs right away. This seems to talk a lot, if you notice, about these peasants not being compensated and being forced to do more work. This sounds more like an economic issue. So let's imagine we've got a specific, or our first body paragraph. It is going to be covering the issue of economic hardship, and that's why peasants rose up. So let me just put that in here. I'm just going to make a simple topic sentence starting off my paragraph. One of the reasons peasants revolted was due to the unfair economic conditions they faced. All right, now I'm going to start actually putting in my evidence to defend what I just said there. And I'm going to use the information and content that I find in this particular document to help me out. So how do I do that? Well, first of all, as I said, I want to make sure that the reader sees which document I'm using. So I'm going to begin my sentence with that phrase, in document 2. Now, you don't have to start at every single thing like this. In fact, you can sometimes just write something out and put document 2 in parentheses at the end of your sentence. But I'm just going to start it this way so that you see right away I am denoting which document I'm using. I'm telling the reader what I'm using. Now, one of the things that College Board has tried to remind people, documents, paintings, diary entries, speeches, these are things, inanimate objects. They do not think, talk, argue, state, or explain anything. They're just items. So you shouldn't use the phrase, in document 2, it says, or in document 2, it states, or document 2 says something or states something. You should always mention something about the people. They're the ones that are actually writing this. These are the two people, Lotzer and Schapeler. They're the two people that are actually making their argument. Now, I may not need to use their names necessarily because both of them, it says, are preachers. So I'm going to do this. In document 2, 2 German preachers argued that lords were oppressing peasants. We see that. It mentions that they're forcing them to do more service, so I'm going to change that to overworking them, and also demanding dues. In other words, asking for more taxes and money from them. And all this, we can assume they're saying, was done unjustly. So in this short sentence, I have basically told the reader what this says. Now, I can go a step beyond and maybe enhance this one sentence with another one. I can say specifically, for 4 decades, German peasants felt like taxes were too high and what was demanded of them in terms of work was excessive. But really, I probably don't need to do that. I think I've pretty much explained what this document says. You never want to get too brief, though. If you ever feel like you can write more or there's something else you want to say, certainly do that. I often think that describing a document sometimes takes a couple of sentences. But since I put this down this way, we're just trying to go over this quickly, this will suffice. Now, the next step is going back to that analysis point. We want to explain to the reader, identify what is the possible bias that these two German preachers have that makes them sympathize with peasants. Why are they saying this particular thing? What is it about their position in society that makes them say that? So I would argue that there are a few things we could mention here. Instead, let's start with this one. I'll go ahead and mention their names. All right. So now I'm starting to explain the bias or point of view of these two. And I'm going to make their point of view very clear by continuing this idea. So I've already said that they were not of the higher class, and that's why they sympathize with peasants that are suffering. I'm going to make it even more clear. They lived among these people. And they saw what overwork and high taxes did to them. So I think I've made it pretty clear now that there is a clear reason for these two to be sympathetic to peasants, having lived among them. I might also mention something about the fact that they're both preachers. In other words, they believe in God, and they probably have a sense of duty to these people to serve them. And they feel like, you know, God says these people are all equal in God's eyes. Anything like that could also work. So you may mention that. There are other ways that you can point out what this is. You can also, to earn this point, you can also point out that these two are clearly addressing the intended audience, and mention who that intended audience is. The intended audience is obviously the Lords themselves. This is basically a plea to the Lords. You need to stop doing something. Now, you'll notice that they're pretty demanding here about what has to stop. But in the end, they do tell the Lords that peasants will still help them when it's necessary and proper, and when it doesn't disadvantage them. So they are also trying to have a tone of compromise. They don't want to just stand up there and write something down that completely turns the Lords off right away, that tells them, look, you're going to do this or else. They're not being that kind of demanding. Why aren't they doing that? Well, because they know that these Lords have armies. These Lords, they need the Lords to actually agree with them. They are trying to be reasonable, just because they know that the people that they're talking to are technically, you know, socially above them. And also those people have, you know, they have armies available to them and could possibly punish the people for making this kind of a statement. So there are other things you can do, but basically you're explaining to the reader just why these guys say what they say. So now you've gotten 3 of the points, right? I mean, as long as you've used 6 of these 6 documents in the same manner, explain what they say. And for 3 of the documents you use, explain why they say what they say. In other words, point out their point of view, bias, audience, purpose, whatever. Once you do that, you've earned 3 more points. You got context, you got thesis. All right, we're set. Now all we need to do is find some evidence from outside the documents. Now, I'm not giving you all 7 documents, so we can't look at every single one and see what's in the content of all of them. But let's just assume that none of the documents talk about another potential cause of these revolts. Let's think about the intellectual cause of these revolts. That is, in Germany around this time, in the middle of the 1400s, the printing press was developed. The printing press, as it printed more reading material, urged people on to learn to read and increased literacy. You think about these two. It might be that 2 lay preachers or preachers from the 1300s might not have even been able to write, but they can write now because of the time period. So explaining that in some ways the printing press plays a role in these uprisings is important. Another thing would be that they may not mention anywhere in here. They may not mention that many of the people who learned about Luther after reading the 95 Thesis because they could read, then went out and preached it directly to the people. So for people who couldn't read, they were also learning about Luther's ideas, about challenging authority. And that was certainly an inspiration for them to do the same thing. You may also mention that there could be political reasons that this is going on, that these people feel like the laws and stuff are not fair that are being produced. Whatever facts you have that don't show up in here, those are ones that can be used for that outside or beyond the document evidence. And you can place that anywhere. For instance, if you wanted to talk about the importance of the printing press and the fact that it taught, it basically created a more literate society, you could connect that to this actual writing by these 2 people. Say, here are people that are not from the upper class. Now they are able to write and read thanks to the printing press having been developed 60 or 70 years previous to this. So that's something you can include. You can include that evidence beyond the documents in any of your body paragraphs, as long as you give more than just a simple mention to it. If we look back at the prompt, remember, our main argument is that socioeconomic discontent was the cause. What Mr. Hunt suggested, remember, is that you have a counter argument. So along with saying we know this is the main cause, we can also say religion also played a role. And hopefully you will find at least 2 documents that tell us, give us examples of religion helping to cause these revolts. So if you can find 2 examples that are more about the social class situations of peasants, 2 examples that focus a little bit more like this one on economics, and 2 examples that talk about religious discontent, you will have used 6 documents. And that's all you need to do, remembering that for at least 3 of those 6 documents, you have to do this part as well. You have to analyze how bias or purpose or point of view impacted the content of that document. So this is just kind of a rough beginning. Obviously, your teachers are going to give you more ideas and direct instruction on how to write these DBQs, but hopefully you can refer back to this. I hope what I told you today was a little helpful, and good luck when you are asked to continue to write your DBQs. And hopefully this May, you'll actually have a full test and you can write the DBQs sitting down in our school gym and answering the test live and in person. I'll talk to you later.